You're 7 years old. Your father hands you to a monk at the abbey gate. No hug, no goodbye speech. This is 1180, and school starts today. You won't see your family again for months, maybe years. The monk leads you into a dark stone room. No desks, no chairs, just a wooden bench and a wax tablet. This is what education looked like for a medieval child, if you were lucky enough to get one. Most children never did. In 789, Charlemagne issued a decree. Every monastery, every cathedral had to open a school, not for peasants, for future priests, monks, and administrators who could read Latin and keep records. That single decree shaped European education for the next 700 years. By the 1100s, cathedral schools were everywhere. Paris, Chartres, Canterbury. Boys as young as 7 entered and stayed until 14 or 15. Girls almost never attended. The exceptions were convent schools, where nuns taught reading, sewing, and prayer to daughters of nobles. Hildegard of Bingen entered a monastery school in Germany at age 8 in 1106. She learned Latin, music, and scripture from an anchoress named Jutta. She later became one of the most famous scholars of her century. For most children, the school day started before sunrise. Mass first, then lessons standing because chairs were rare and expensive. There was no paper. Paper barely existed in Europe yet. Students wrote on wax tablets, wooden frames filled with beeswax, scratched with a metal stylus. Make a mistake, and you smooth the wax flat and start it again. Younger children learned from a hornbook. A single wooden paddle with a sheet of parchment glued to it, covered by a thin layer of transparent horn to protect it from dirty fingers. On it, the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer. Older students moved to parchment, made from stretched animal skin. One book might use the skins of 200 sheep. A single volume could cost as much as a small farm. The curriculum was Latin, almost entirely Latin. Grammar first, using a textbook by a 4th century Roman named Donatus. Students memorized entire sections before they understood a word of what they were saying. After grammar came logic, then rhetoric. Together, these 3 subjects were called the trivium. Master them, and you could move on to arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the quadrivium. Discipline was brutal by modern standards. Teachers carried a ferula, a flat wooden paddle, or a bundle of birch rods. A wrong answer, a forgotten line, a moment of laughter, any of it could earn a beating across the palms or the back. One 12th century monk, Guibert of Nogent, wrote that his tutor beat him so often for minor mistakes that he began to view all learning as a form of punishment. Not every school beat its students, but corporal punishment was accepted, expected, and rarely questioned by parents. Many believed pain sharpened memory. Then in 1088, something new appeared in Bologna, Italy. A group of students hired their own teachers and organized themselves into a guild. They called it a universitas, the first university in Europe. Students at these early universities were often teenagers, some as young as 14. They traveled from across the continent, sleeping 4 or 5 to a room, often going hungry, and studying by candlelight because oil and wax cost money they didn't have. By 1096, teaching was already happening at Oxford. By 1150, the University of Paris had formed around the schools attached to Notre Dame. Classes had no textbooks to hand out. A teacher read from a single manuscript, and the students copied every word by hand. If you missed class, you missed the only copy of that lecture in existence. University students weren't gentle scholars. Records from Oxford and Paris describe brawls between students and townspeople so frequent that in 1355, a dispute over wine in an Oxford tavern turned into a 2-day riot. 63 students died. The event became known as the St. Scholastica Day riot. For children who weren't destined for the church or a university, education looked completely different. Most boys started work by age 7, apprenticed to a guild master, a blacksmith, a weaver, a carpenter. An apprenticeship typically lasted 7 years. The boy lived with the master's family, worked 6 days a week, and learned by watching and repeating, not by reading a book. Girls in craft families often learned a trade too, working alongside their mothers, though guilds rarely let them become masters themselves. For peasant children, the vast majority of the population, formal school didn't exist at all. Their education was the field, the animals, the household. Reading was a skill they would likely never need and never have a chance to learn. By some estimates, fewer than 10% of people in medieval Europe could read. Literacy was a privilege tied to the church, to wealth, or to a trade that required it. Late in the medieval period, that started to shift. In 1382, William of Wykeham founded Winchester College in England, one of the first schools built specifically to educate boys who weren't destined for the priesthood. In 1440, King Henry VI founded Eton, intended to offer free education to poor scholars alongside the sons of nobles. These schools were still rare, still small, still mostly for boys. But they were a crack in a system that, for centuries, had treated education as something owed to a chosen few. A medieval classroom had no clocks, no grades, no summer vacation. Learning was tied to the church calendar, to feast days and fasting days, to the rhythm of a world governed by bells. And yet, from those cold stone rooms, wax tablets and Latin grammar drilled through fear and repetition, came the scholars who built the first universities, the copied manuscripts that preserved ancient knowledge, and a system of learning that, centuries later, still shapes how a classroom looks today.